I'm going to be talking today about the domestication of the polis in Aristophanes' Assemblywomen. So this is a topic in Aristophanic comedy, which I think you can see in lots of different plays, but I will be focusing particularly on this play because it's the play you're about to see. But before we start looking at it, I'd just like to deal with these concepts first. When I talk about the domestication of the polis, I'm talking about the relationship in Aristophanes' Assemblywomen between the oikos and the polis. The oikos in Greek culture, well, oikos is the word for the household, the house. It may literally mean the building, the house, but like in English, the house has lots and lots of associations. So the house may stand to represent the family that lives in the house, both the living family and the ancestors of that family, and the progeny of that family, the children and grandchildren, the future of that family. It doesn't just include the family, it also includes the property of that family. There's the living property and the movable property, such as livestock or animals. So all of this private property is embodied in the idea of the oikos. The polis, on the other hand, represented here by the Acropolis, represents the communal public life of the community. So it can't, just like the oikos can't be limited by the architecture of the house, so the polis does not really describe a geographical unit or a collection of urban buildings within a certain proximity of each other. It describes the community that lives in that area, in that whole region, their history and their future, their culture, and everything which they share. Okay, so when we think about these two concepts, which are sort of structuring but complementary opposition in Greek life, we can also think about this in terms of the theatre. So the Athenian theatre, as we all know, is an outdoor theatre, and in the case of Athens, when you sat in the theatre of Dionysus, you would look over the rest of the city. Between the auditorium, between the spectators in the auditorium and the rest of the city, in the 5th century would be a skene building. This skene building almost always represents a house or a household, an oikos in the widest sense. I've got another picture here to represent how it would look more like how it would look from the seats in the theatre. So you're sitting in the seat, and before you is a stage building which represents an oikos. Beyond that stage building is the polis. And so we have in Athenian drama a kind of physical, concrete representation of this opposition, of this complementary opposition between the polis and the oikos. Now, what I propose to do in this lecture is consider this opposition, or this complementarity, in the context of Aristophanes' Assemblywomen. This is the play which you're about to see, and I won't waste too much time telling you the plot. But in brief, we have the women displeased by the governance of the city, who conspire to disguise themselves as men, go to the assembly, persuade the men to hand over governance of the city to them. Under the new female governance of the city, all property is made communal, including women. The women of the city are made communal, and both the family and the household are abolished, the individual household. So in considering how this play figures this opposition between oikos and polis, I want to look at 3 passages. The first is the passage with which the play begins. We have Praxagora, a figure of perhaps ambiguous gender emerging from the house, emerging from that skene building. And as she comes out, she's carrying a lamp, and she salutes this lamp in these hyper-poetic terms. O radiant disk of my ceramic lamp, fairest invention of skilled artisans, I shall reveal your pedigree and your fortunes fair. For whirled on the wheel by the potter's impetus, you hold the sun's radiant beams, radiant honours in your nozzles. Now send forth the fiery signal as arranged. She then praises the lamp for being privy to our plot, and rightly you also stand by us in our bedrooms as we execute Aphrodite's maneuvers, and when our bodies are flexed, no one banishes from the room your supervisory eye. You alone shine your light in the hushed-up recesses between our thighs. And when you singe away the hair that spouts there, and you stand by us and we stealthily open the pantry, stocked with bread and the liquor of Bacchus, and you never babble to the neighbours about the things that you've abetted. Right, so you can see in these opening lines this address, this apostrophe to the lamp, in which he borrows from tragic diction and indeed tragic imagery. Now we can see how this, particularly the initial passage, seems to represent various possible tragic passages. This is the beginning of Euripides' Phoenician Women, in which Jocasta emerges from the house and salutes the sun. O sun god, you who cut your path in heaven's stars, mounted on a chariot and laboured gold and whirling out your flames swift horses. On the other hand, that's Euripides' Jocasta. We also have in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, you have Aegisthus emerging from the house and also saluting the gracious light of day. So these are both scenes, tragic scenes, in which someone emerges from the darkness of the house and greets the light which is visible. Here, of course, in the case of Praxagora, that dynamic is disturbed. Praxagora emerges from the darkened Skene and salutes the light, but it is the light of the indoors, the light of the lamp. Thus, an opposition which is actually fundamental to Greek drama between the darkness of the oikos and the light of the city is disrupted, and the distinction between the internal and the external confused. This confusion is relevant to one of the two central themes of the play, the relationship between male and female. As we said, this is a play in which women will appropriate male prerogatives, first by deception when they go to the assembly, and then through an enactment of laws. In these opening lines, we see a comparable appropriation, not of male prerogatives per se, but of masculine discourse. So it's not just that they salute the sun, they also salute it in such a way that recalls male activities and male discourse. And here I quote from Angus Bowie, "The lamp is addressed in ways which would characterize it as the equivalent in the female sphere of several aspects of the male. It stands for an internal world that is opposed to the external world of the men, but at the same time complementary to it." And he gives examples of how this works. So when she talks about the signs, which the signal being passed around by the flame, these are like male beacon signs that the military, the Greek armies would use to communicate across long distances. It lights a lovemaking that is described, a female activity, but is described as a kind of wrestling, here in the translation, executing maneuvers. It stands by as a parastates and epistates, these various languages of standing by as a companion, which are associated with hoplite warfare or with athletics. It also lights the storehouses of the house. Now, these storehouses are described as stoas, which are, in fact, public porticos, so that the interior of the house is made into a kind of public storehouse. So the lamp address is not just a paratragic parody, but a carefully articulated perversion of the normal relationship of stage-building darkness and on-stage brightness on the one hand, and a female mirroring of male activity on the other. The sun, a universal and preeminent symbol of the public, communal, male world, has been identified with a lamp, a symbol of the dark and murky female interior, and it's thus been feminized. And the public institutions of the polis, military signals, hoplite service, wrestling pitches, public storehouses, have been translated into private domestic phenomena of sex, personal grooming, and midnight snacks. These female-coded activities, embodied in the lamp that facilitates them, have been effectively brought outside the house onto the public stage. As she brings the lamp onto the stage, she brings these activities, which the lamp has facilitated, onto the public stage as well. So even in these opening lines of the play, we see the oikos already beginning to displace the polis in the public view. This brings me to the second passage I want to discuss, where the domestication of the polis is made explicit. So here, this is a conversation between Blepyrus, Praxagoras' husband, and Praxagoras in the middle of the play. But Blepyrus is inquiring after details of the new regime. He asks, what standard of living will you establish? Praxagoras says, the same for all. I propose to remodel the city, knocking down all partitions and remodeling it into one big household where everyone can come and go as they please. Now, this revolution, if we can call it that, is expressed during the agone, or the debate between Praxagora and her husband and another male neighbour. By this point, you'll recall, the plot has already been launched. Praxagora has already persuaded the assembly to hand over governance to the women. This has been reported to Blepyrus by his neighbour, and then by Blepyrus is reporting it to Praxagora, who feigns ignorance. So, of course, she has been the key agent in this transformation. It's only in this scene, however, that the specifics of the new regime are revealed. There are two significant parts of this. First of all, as Praxagora says, all private property will be turned over to a common fund in which everyone shares, so that there are no rich and no poor. To make this work, Praxagora explains, and this is the second part, all women will have to be made common property also. The city, thus, will become an oikasis, a single household. As part of this transformation, the central public spaces of the city are converted into domestic areas and activities. Thus, the courthouses you see here in this passage, the courthouses which are symbolic of the law, and the porticos or storehouses, symbolic of the economy, are converted into dining rooms. I'll turn all the courthouses and porticos into dining rooms. The speaker's platform, symbolic of democracy, is converted into a stage for an epic bard to accompany a meal. Note how Aristophanes deliberately recalls the prologue here, with a mention of these porticos, which Praxagora had used to describe the shelves inside her back room. Praxagora had appropriated the language of public architecture to describe a private storeroom. Now she intends to appropriate the actual public building for dining, a definitively private activity in Athens. So what was using public language to describe private space has now become an appropriation of public space for what is traditionally a private activity. Now, it's a paradox, but Praxagora's policy involves at the same time the destruction of the oikos, the household, as an institution, with the abolition of both private property and the family, and at the same time the championing of the oikos as a mode of governance. This is an important point. Praxagora and her co-conspirators successfully execute a communistic revolution, and one that involves both property and sex. And this revolution is neither reversed, as it is in Lysistrata, nor is it explicitly condemned within the play. It's a thrilling document for the radicals among us. And yet we should be very aware of its limits. There is no end to the system of slavery. Instead, Praxagora demands that slaves should be equally distributed and shared. And Praxagora does not promote or even envisage any general reversal of gender roles in Athenian society. This is the second passage here, when she's explaining to Blepyrus right at the beginning of this conversation. No, you interrupt me too soon. This is what I was going to say. I'll begin by making land, money, and everything that is private property common to all. Then we shall live on this commonwealth, which we shall take care to administer with wise thrift. So they will share all their property. But sorry, it's the other passage I wanted to read, sorry. So Blepyrus says, who will till the soil? Praxagora says, the slaves will till the soil. How shall we obtain clothing? Praxagora says, you'll wear out those you have, and then we women will weave you others. Women will continue to provide the clothing for men. Meanwhile, the men are free to simply enjoy a life of leisure. So the new regime is defined not by a reversal of male dominance, but by a kind of male utopia, in which they have no responsibilities at all. That's what you see in that upper passage. And what is this utopia? It is, as I said, a household, a polis converted into a household in which, as in the Greek household, the women are responsible for all duties. So what I'm trying to say here is it's not in the sphere of gender that the great inversion of this play takes place. It's rather in the sphere of government. The third passage I want to draw your attention to is the one which just follows this one. And this is in which Blepyrus' honest neighbour sets about following Praxagora's instructions. So all property has been made communal. So the neighbour says he's going to take his possessions to the marketplace, he collect them all and take an inventory. And he then proceeds to go in and out of his house, bringing objects from inside and lining them up on the stage. You there, my pretty Miss Sifter, first of my possessions. Come outside here prettily. You'll be the basket bearer, being well powdered. And after emptying so many sacks of my flour. And who will be the chair bearer? Miss Potts, come outside here. By Zeus, you're black. You must have boiled the concoction the Lysistrate uses to dry his hair. This way, stand next to her. So you imagine he's going in, he's bringing out these household implements, and he's lining them up on the stage. Now, once again, we are reminded of the opening scene of the play, in which Praxagora had emerged from the oikos, the darkened scaena, carrying a lamp. But that domestic export is now multiplied fivefold or sixfold as the oikos is symbolically gutted and the polis correspondingly domesticated. And just as Praxagora had addressed her lamp in grandiloquent and tragic terms, as if she was saluting the sun himself, the neighbor grants absurd personifications to these household implements. They are addressed as agents, told to come outside, to stand behind one another. They are told to arrange themselves and decorate themselves as if for a parade. Once again, this is not merely slapstick or the play of incongruity, though it is funny on that level too. Aristophanes is not parodying a generic parade, but a specific one. Indeed, the most famous Athenian parade of them all. This is the Panathenaic procession, the centerpiece of the Panathenaic festival, which is represented on the Parthenon frieze. This is the procession which you'll see on that frieze, which involves a kind of total representation of the Athenian polis, including both its male and female parts, its economic capacities, its religious commitments. Significantly, however, the neighbor does not seek to represent the male components of this march, but rather certain female participants. So you have the kenephoros, the diphrophoros, these are the Greek terms for what he describes here, the basket carriers, the chair bearers, and so on. These are specific roles in the Panathenaic procession held by women who would bring these gifts up to the Acropolis for Athena. These distinguished figures carry offerings for Athena, offerings which are indeed identical to those now being brought out by the obedient neighbor. This is not to suggest that the neighbor's actions will be taken seriously by a pious Athenian audience. Certainly, the little line of perhaps jumbo-sized household implements would have been welcomed with laughter rather than reverence. The scene's, in fact, reminiscent of a similar kind of episode in Aristophanes' Wasps, where a cheese grater and a dog are variously made to represent the plaintiff and the defendant and the jury in a court. So this is an Aristophanic kind of ploy to bring objects out and have them represent things. No, this is not a serious representation of ritual. Rather, Aristophanes is simply pointing out that the revolution depicted in this play, that of the domestication, the triumph of the oikos, and the domestication of the polis, is not so foreign to Athenian political culture as might be presumed. Athens, it is clear, already has an elevated place for the oikos. The apparatus of private life is central to the public and religious life of the city. The polis was always already a domestic institution, at least in some respects. And these women are perhaps to be regarded as simply highlighting this aspect of Athenian political life. Okay, so I began this talk by emphasizing a powerful, though complementary, opposition of Athenian life between the male and public polis and the female and private oikos. I observed this structuring opposition was represented, or rather concretized, in Athenian drama by the fundamental architecture of the theatre, with the scaena building representing the enclosed area, the darkened interior of the oikos. I looked for Aristophanes for explorations of this principle. And I said that it was in Assemblywomen that Aristophanes substantially develops this idea. In the prologue of the play, we see the playwright toying with dramatic convention, having Praxagora emerge from a darkened oikos and addressing her lamp as a kind of sun, literally bringing to light the secret female activities within. Later, she explains, all individual households will be destroyed, only to be replaced by a single large oikos, coterminous with the whole city. The polis is to become an oikos. This is the important part of the revolution. Other gender and social inversions are more limited. There is no general feminist regime. Finally, in the mock-up of the Panathenaic procession, Aristophanes suggests something more subtle about this domestication, that perhaps it is not so revolutionary after all. As it turns out, Athenians already make enormous room for the domestic within their politics. We need not say in their case that the personal is political, because the political is already personal.